Firstly, if you don't mind, there's a little personal anecdote. After being with Divine Mother for some while, I went to her one day and I tried to kneel down in front of her, but she would never allow that, nor would she hug anyone or embrace them. But I wanted to thank her with all my heart. So I said to her, I want to thank you because after all of these years, my family is in harmony. And she retorted to me, but of course, it's because you were never there for them. You were too busy looking for God. And it reminded me of that Sufi allegory that allows a question to be asked. And it's that story about that very, very rich merchant by the name of Ahmed. So Ahmed had a fleet of ships that plied the 7 seas. He had warehouses that were full of goods that could be traded and sold. He had a palatial house with many servants. But then disaster came to him. His ships floundered at sea and sank. His warehouses burned down. His servants left him. And so he became penniless. But he had many, many influential friends, rich and influential friends, one of them being the King of Spain, who was his personal friend. But in these circumstances, poor Ahmed could not even face the friends who lived around him. But he thought to himself that if he found his way back to his friend, the King of Spain, that he might be able to obtain from him the king's largesse. So taking the few belongings that were left to him, he set out on the journey to Spain. But along the way he was beset by bandits who took from him the very last of his possessions, even his clothing. So he had to be dressed in rags and make his way as best he could. But in the process, his face became burned by the sun, the elements, and by the time he arrived at the great city where the palace of the King of Spain was located, he looked and acted like a beggar. And so even to make himself presentable enough to go to the palace to seek his meeting with the king, he had to take on the work as a porter, carrying people's baggage and goods to earn a few coins to buy suitable clothing to go to present himself to the palace. But after some time scraping enough money together, and he presented himself at the palace, the guards looked at him, seeing that he was so rough. His speech by now was rough like a peasant's because of his burned skin. He no longer had the courtesies, protocols that were part of society. They'd fallen off him somewhere along the way. So it came to pass that he had to come under tutelage to learn the manners that were suitable when you're in the presence of a king. But after some time, finally, he was deemed ready to be brought into the presence of the king. And when it happened, the king, even though his friend was darkened and roughened by life, recognized him immediately and welcomed him graciously. Tell me what's happened to you. So Ahmed told his tale of woe, how he'd lost his ships and his merchandise and all the rest. "Oh," said the king, don't worry, it will be taken care of." And then the king called one of his advisors over to him, and he said to him, "Give this man 100 sheep." But Ahmed was quite shocked, because he was expecting much, much more than this. But what could he do? He took his 100 sheep and he went off to the mountain, but he didn't know the way of sheep. So in a very short while, some of them had wandered off and got lost, and others starved to death, and their lambs died, until in a very short while the 100 sheep were gone, and Ahmed had to go back to the king and tell him what had happened. So the king called his advisor, he said, give this man 50 sheep. So Ahmed took his 50 sheep and went off again, but by this time he'd learned a little of the ways of sheep. But as it happened, a flock of wolves came by and killed most of the sheep, and the rest ran off. So poor Ahmed had to go back to the king and again ask for his largesse, and the king said to his advisor, "Give this man 25 sheep." So Ahmed went off with his 25 sheep. But something had happened to Ahmed, and somehow his sheep flourished. They had healthy ewes, and the flock grew. So after some time, Ahmed was rich again. He was able to build himself a fine house and fine clothing. So he was able to go back to the king to thank him for his largesse and show him that he had achieved this state of now well-being and being rich once again. So the king said to Ahmed, "Well, now I'm going to make you the governor of the great city of Cordoba." And Ahmed was greatly surprised, but he couldn't help himself asking the question of the king, well, why didn't you give this to me when I first came to you? And the king replied, "Well, let's just say, if I had made you the governor of Cordoba when you first came to me, there would not be a stone left standing in Cordoba now." So the question that arises, which is probably obvious to you from this story, what happened to Ahmed? What shift and change took place in Ahmed? What's your experience in your relationship with life?
Could it be working with what you have, making the most of just what you have is enough, and from that can grow?
I take it back to my own personal story. I don't, even though in coming into Divine Mother's presence, my thought was, I've arrived, I've found what I was looking for. I wouldn't have said I'd found God, even though that's what appeared for me. But what was it about what happened to bring harmony to the family? So it brought me to the place where I wanted to kneel down in front of her and say, thank you, thank you.
It's paying attention to the details in front of you, isn't it? What you need to, paying attention to the details in front of you, what you need to do. It's not there.
Right. Yes, it was. Because she said, it's because you were never there for them. You were too busy looking for God. How does that relate to Ahmed, do you think? How does it relate to us and our relationship with life?
Sort of like a bit of a sense of entitlement, really, but it's and one-pointedness, and yes, and I don't mean entitlement, maybe Ahmed a little bit, but very one-pointed in gaining, you know what you want there, but yeah, not really seeing anything that's around you.
Right.
So it's having to pull away all of those veils, really, to see what's there, what's always been there, what is there.
Yes, yes, yes.
I came home to Jasmine just recently, and she's troubles at school and everything's all. And I've been away working, and in this last week we've just settled. It's just been the most serene feeling, just being within the home and just calmed and so peaceful. And we've just been together, not trying to fix anything, just sharing. And it just felt this really nice feeling without seeking it, just settling. And it was kind of going away and doing all that made me so much more aware of how peaceful. Coming back to just being present
Yes.
from my experience.
I think that also I know with my beautiful children that I've had over the years too, and I always never realised how lucky I was and what a beautiful experience it was just to be the mother and have those wonderful experiences with my children. There was always something driving me that there was something outside of what I was experiencing that I wanted to have.
Yes.
And not,
Exactly.
yes, and not realising it was there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought I'd lost my little girl when she'd all grown up and become all strong and independent, and then the last week she says, "Can you just hold me?" Oh, it's always there, that softness and that.
Yes. Thank you, thank you, thank you.